to Dornith Doherty and Giovanni Aloi, and to you everyone who's joined us this evening. Welcome to the third day of Phytopia, our exhibition. We are Science Gallery Bengaluru, and we have started programming about 10 months ago. We are a new institution, and we are a part of an international network of 8 galleries across the world. But in Bangalore, we are established with funding from the government of Karnataka, and we work in partnership with the Indian Institute of Science, the National Center for Biological Sciences, and Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology. This program is also organized in collaboration with the Bangalore International Center. Allow me to briefly introduce to you our guests for this evening. A 2012 Guggenheim Foundation Fellow, Dornith Doherty is an American artist working primarily with photography, video, and scientific imaging. Dornith was born in Houston, Texas, and has studied at Rice University and Yale University. Her work has been featured widely in the United States as well as abroad. Collaborating with scientists and seed banks on over 5 continents, she has traced in precise detail the elaborate systems of secure spaces and technological interventions required for botanical preservation. She reflects upon poetic questions about life and time through artworks created from X-rays, captured from seeds, tissue samples, and cloned plants preserved in these collections. Dornith's work, Archiving Eden, is displayed in Phytopia. So those of you who haven't had the chance to visit the exhibition, we welcome you. The exhibition is open for the next 10 days. Giovanni Aloi is an art historian who studied in Milan and then at Goldsmiths University, London. Giovanni currently teaches at the School of Art Institute of Chicago, Sotheby's Institute of Art in New York, and the Tate Galleries in London. His first book was titled Art and Animals and was published in 2011. He has been the editor-in-chief of Antenna, the Journal of Nature in Visual Culture, and we are grateful that Giovanni and his colleagues have permitted us to display 2 issues of Antenna, Why Look at Plants and Beyond Morphology, which you will find in Phytopia's reading room. Let us proceed with the evening. This discussion follows a lecture that was premiered a few minutes ago and ended a few minutes ago, with Dornith first outlining for us her practice and the absolutely fascinating images that she has from these seed banks across the world, followed by a conversation with Giovanni, where he asked her questions that, only a person with his training could have asked, because I have very different questions for Dornith. So to sum up in a couple of sentences, and Dornith and Giovanni, please, let me know if there's anything more you wanted to add or if I've misrepresented you in any way. To sort of bring it all together, what Dornith does does in the project Archiving Eden, about which she has spoken to us this evening, is that she visits seed banks across the world, as I mentioned, and then images them using X-rays, but also sometimes regular photography of the places themselves, which are equally fascinating photographs. And then these images at a scale at which one doesn't usually imagine seeing them are displayed as artworks, which allows us an insight into these embryos of life, as Giovanni called them, and Dornith, I think, also called them, in a very, very different way. In fact, some of the images, as you know, my team and I were looking at them after reaching out to Dornith. My team members were trying to fool me by asking me, okay, what do you think this is? Is this a seahorse? Is this a this? Is this a that? Without, of course, me knowing what they were actually asking me about. So they're quite incredible images, which you will see in the exhibition. So what we have is a fascination with seed banks that Dornith brings to us. And in an exhibition on plants, of course, it's most appropriate. In Giovanni, we have an interpreter and interlocutor who looks at these images, of course, as a cultural historian, as an art historian, looking at how natural history gets represented in visual culture. So may I sort of begin the evening and use my privilege to ask you the first set of questions. May I begin by talking to you, Giovanni, as we've sort of had Dornith's explanatory lecture just a few minutes ago, and then come back after you to Dornith again to bring it all again together. So, Giovanni, would you like to tell us in a few words what is it about nature, and especially botany or plants, that you find interesting in your own work, and how does that manifest itself in the work we do with Antenna and the fabulous 2 volumes that you've allowed us to display?
Thank you. And thank you for having me, of course. Well, it's a complicated question to answer, and yet I guess probably the easiest. I could talk about it for 2 hours, so I'm going to keep it really short. But I was always interested in art and nature since I was a kid. And it was just a matter of understanding as I grew up how they could be combined, or whether I had to choose one or the other. And, growing up in Italy, our education system was very structured and old-fashioned, so it seemed like I would have to choose one or the other, and I ended up choosing art because I wasn't too fluent in chemistry and biology, so I saw that as a bit of a hurdle in my love for nature. But when I moved to London and I studied art at Goldsmiths, they enabled me to research nature and art together, which was a fantastic turning point in my life. There's a history of art and nature that's very complicated. I wrote about it in different works, different books and articles. And nature has always been the underdog in art. We always privilege ourselves. Art, you can say to a certain degree around the world, and especially in Western art, has been thoroughly anthropocentric. It's about us, reflections of us. And even when we have painted animals and plants throughout history, we've turned them into symbols of ourselves or our emotions and our ethical values or morals. So even when we see animals and plants in the paintings or sculptures, they really represent us once again. And I believe that that's the biggest issue in our relationship with nature. We're not able to see nature beyond ourselves. And that also plays a major role in climate change, in our lack of appreciation for nature itself and interest in nature itself. I find incredibly surprising that we're not more strongly denouncing our state of alienation in relation to nature. It is always surprising to me to think that we find it acceptable not to know the names of our trees, or what the trees on our streets do, or what cycles of nature entail. We're just being miseducated not to care about nature. And what I try to do with my work is to enthuse people about nature generally through Antenna and through my publications, and also to provide alternatives, ways to engage with nature through art, and explain why art actually can make people consider nature from a different perspective, because in a sense, other disciplines have failed us.
Interesting. And I actually find it quite fascinating that you connect our sort of, in a way, lack of love for nature and, climate change, which is a challenge that we confront today. And, in fact, when we organized our exhibition Submerge, which was about water, and we moved away very consciously from talking about water as a resource to talk about, water as an entity, right? It's quirky, it's fascinating, it just defies all kinds of rules. And someone asked me, why did you choose this approach? And the answer, in a way, it emerged as I was answering that person, which is that, in a way, what we want people to do is to love water, because when you love and care for something, in many ways, the conservation aspects of it or the care aspects of it are not things you have to convince people of. If you take care of the basic, if you create a basic relationship, and it's quite actually astonishing that we find ourselves in a time that this relationship is so broken that we need to kind of reconsider how we even frame discussing nature. Would you have sort of memories or interesting things that you would probably want to share with our audiences about the two volumes that we have shared? If I'm putting you on the spot, tell me.
No, absolutely not. They've been published a long time ago. That was 2011, and they came out of a sense of tiredness with a certainty in academia of what an animal was. At the time, I was lucky enough to be part of an extremely exciting group of scholars in London who really pioneered animal studies. The discipline of animal studies, for those who are not familiar with it, although it has become really prominent over the past few years, started towards the end of the 90s. And again, like in art, where nature has been sort of underdog, overlooked subject, the same can be said about philosophy. So scholars from different disciplines, including literature, art, history, philosophy, and animal husbandry, all started to gather together in order to fill that void. And what I found the environment extremely stimulating, interesting, and fertile. However, a few years into it, we're talking about 2011, so 10 years into it, I felt like there was a lot of reliance on scientific conceptions of what an animal in animal studies might be. And I noticed that conversations became very animal-centric. So the claim of animal studies was to be non-anthropocentric. And I started to wonder if it was fair or right or productive to shift the paradigm from anthropocentrism to animal centrism. And I started to wonder more about ecosystems. And at the same time, there was a rise in interest in the concept of the Anthropocene, and climate change began to predominate, and plants kept being left out. So the two issues that you very kindly decided to include in the exhibition were a statement, a kind of provocation and a bit of a protest to actually use a space like Antenna that had revolved around animal studies mainly until that point, and make it into a space for plants, at least for two issues. And one of the things that I remember very fondly from those two issues is the discussion among scholars that I initiated that worked really well at a time where social media wasn't quite in our bloodstreams as it is today. I think today it's very easy to just post something on Facebook and trigger a discussion on a subject. You'll get lots of comments. Instead, at that time, in the prehistory of the social dimension, I set up a blog and I asked a number of scholars who were part of the animal studies circle to contribute. And when I say scholars, I also mean artists who are involved in the subject. I don't really draw a line between the two categories. In fact, I think we should just eliminate them. And it was really interesting to notice that many scholars were very engaged in the question of the plant. So it was taken seriously. That certainly is one of my highlights on those issues, beyond the many interesting contributions, because it really captures the moment and it captures people's concerns. There are concerns about bringing plants forward and the idea that it might challenge animal rights or take away something from vegan politics, or if I have to have compassion for plants, then what can I eat? There were so many interesting questions I think we raised in that discussion. And when I say we, I mean Antenna, but also everyone who participated, that then have become central to the conversation of critical plant studies when it developed a few years thereafter. So that's certainly my most interesting memory of that journey.
Lovely. Thank you, Giovanni. To our audiences, do bear in mind, I'm not the only one allowed to ask questions, so do please post your questions in the Q&A box. Dornith, if I may move to you and ask you my first, and the question that I really have been wanting to ask you for a while. How was it to go to Svalbard? Because it's it's just an absolutely fascinating place. So my question is, did they give you a rifle? Did they warn you against polar bears? What was it like to go to Svalbard?
It was, Svalbard was the initial seed bank that I read about in an article written by John Seabrook in the New Yorker called Sowing for the Apocalypse. Mm-hmm. And before that time, I was not familiar with seed banks. And, but I read about Svalbard, and it was such a shocking vision. It was so simultaneously apocalyptic and then utopian that this, one guy had spent 35 years trying to establish a Noah's Ark. I really wanted to go, but it's only open for like 2 days a year when they accession new seeds. It's not a research site like most national gene banks, where they have a research arm that has labs and scientists working on a variety of topics. It's really like a giant safety deposit box based on individual contributions by nations. So the diplomatic part of it is really complicated, and up until that time, it was not something that, it's not an ecotourism site, and in fact, it's built very much like a bunker. So I started working in the U.S. for 2 years, and then got an invitation to accompany Carrie Fowler and Ulla Westingen when they went to make deposits in March of 2010. So walking into that space after working at seed banks all around, and then walking into this amazing one that inspired the whole project was incredible. And, what you can see from the outside in Svalbard is just this little tiny green light and an entry door. And then the rest of it is submerged in the mountaintop. So it's really quite dramatic when you walk into it. And there's a long, long tunnel that goes down that had like ribbons of ice going down on either side. And they monitor it remotely during the time that it's not open. And, it was super interesting because it's one of those places that took me 2 days to get there. You fly in ever smaller planes, and then you land on an airstrip that's like, one of the places where they roll up a little metal stairway. There's no, I live in Dallas, so there's a huge airport, and, so, and then we flew over with the seeds, and they brought them in by hand in a little wagon. They unloaded it, and by hand would carry it down this long tunnel. So it was just really, as you're standing there, and it's like, I'm from Texas, it's super hot here, and I was wearing literally every piece of clothing I owned, and I was bundled up and so cold and so much in awe about the notion of being in this super biodiverse place. So it was a really profound experience for me. And, and also difficult, the conditions are difficult. It's difficult to make photographs in there. at the time I was still using film. So I had a view camera, which is a big 19th century technology, very mechanical. And all my photography friends were like, well, there's no way you can go to the North Pole without taking a digital camera as a backup. There's too many things that can go wrong. So of course that was the camera that froze. So after 8 hours of being in this super cold, no matter what I would do, I was wearing batteries, up against my body, and then, but the 19th century camera just never broke. So it was amazing, even though at one point, a polar wind, I was up behind it. There's a picture that is from that moment where I'm standing on the ridge behind the vault itself, and a polar wind comes up and picks me up and the camera, and I just slide. I thought I was going all the way down the mountain, but I, stopped myself right at the base of the entry. So it was super, super interesting. and super inspiring.
So it is, well, I was about to say it sounds like an expedition. It doesn't actually sound like it is an expedition.
Oh yeah, it's clearly. Oh, and about the polar bears, it's interesting because people kept giving me advice. They were like, in all seriousness, they would say, if you're in a place that usually has seals and there are no seals, that there's a polar bear around. And they evidently put their paw over their nose, so it's the only black part, so they're completely camouflaged. And I was like, okay, well, I'm from Texas. I don't know where seals are supposed to be. And so it was hilarious. So yeah, everybody carried rifles with them, when we were out and about. It was really quite, made an impression on me.
Wonderful. Could you, I mean, I could listen to this for a long time. Could you tell us a little bit more about, so did you manage to visit also the St. Petersburg Vavilov seed collection as well?
I did. And that was another challenging entry, but so important. And they were very generous with their time and their access. And that is such an amazing seed bank, and especially for its history, which if people have watched I think I go into the history a little bit when I talk about the work. We recorded that a couple of weeks ago, but so it's in the original palace that Vavilov started it in. And so you're walking into rooms that are like the origin point for a really important, the first comprehensive seed bank in the world was there. And then I also went to Kuban, which is about 1,000 miles away, and photographed their kind of research station seed bank, which is a village of about 1,000 people, called Botanica. And then I also went to a couple of other seed banks where they had research stations around St. Petersburg where they kept some of the live collections as well, that have to be kept in fields as live collections rather than, they don't have an extensive cryogenic facility for cloned plants, so they keep them as live collections. So I was able to photograph that, which was really interesting as well. So all in all, I went to 4 places in Russia.
Wow. Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. And the third one, I thought I would, after having asked you about the 2 places that I wish I would have visited, I want to ask you about a third, which would be, which of the seed banks that you visited across the world in a way touched you most? Maybe the story, maybe the politics, maybe the, whatever. But why? Yeah. So I'd like to know which one has touched you most, and why does it stay with you?
Well, in each seed bank, I would have conversations with the scientists that were very inspirational, just because they would have some aspect related to their research or the collections and the kind of efforts that they make. So in each way, every time I would go, I would have some amazing kind of eye-opening moment of an aha moment that would be very profound. But, Svalbard is hard to beat because of it being the inspiration and the narrative of a doomsday ball behind it. And then, of course, Russia was important too, because they really did have that doomsday moment where, 600,000 people died of starvation in that city. And while the seed bank was there, and this scientist died of starvation protecting the seeds. So all of that complicated history is moving, but I think the inspirational aspect of Svalbard is wonderful, because it really talks about people collaborating to solve issues. And so the hope that's embedded in Svalbard for me is a very important aspect of seed banking as a process in general.
Thank you. So what I find fascinating is the discussion that you've mentioned it now, but you were also in the discussion with Giovanni about why even the need for a seed bank, right? And therefore on the one hand, the Garden of Eden or the Noah's Ark aspect of it, where you find representation for everything that belongs or everything that grows on this planet. But at the same time, of course, it is being preserved for a catastrophic or an apocalyptic situation when we no longer have access to any of this. And at this moment, we are somewhere in between, right? Inching, of course, towards the catastrophe, but somewhere sort of on that scale, where monoculture in agriculture especially, and so we had Gabriela Sotolaveaga talk yesterday about the Green Revolution and Mexico and India, and and that came up quite strongly. What the Green Revolution or industrial agriculture, one might say, right? The Green Revolution is one part of the larger story of industrial agriculture in the 20th century, with the Soviet Union leading it in one way, the Western Bloc leading it in another way. But the idea was in a sense converging, right? Like where it's massive, large-scale landholding, be it the state, be it industrial farming, and monocropping. As a result of which, we lost a lot of crop variety, plant variety, and for lack of a better word, biodiversity. And I'm just trying to kind of make sense of how, between these two sort of, the catastrophe and the utopia, we are here in the here and now. Have you seen seed banks in a way intervene, or which are seed banks you saw intervene in this situation to make an argument for reintroduction of diversity back, especially into food, because it's also an argument that takes into account, on the one hand, it's agriculture, on the other hand, it's biodiversity, and the two meeting is a very sort of, the interface is very, or not, it's not an interface. The two meeting is a very it's not a very populated land, right? Like where the discussion on biodiversity is all about rewilding, for example. Or not all, but for the bulk of it. And then agriculture is, of course, about feeding people and food security and tackling hunger. So in your experience, having talked to various scientists, having seen various seed banks, where do you see them and when do you see them intervening?
Well, I think that, it's such an interesting topic and such an interesting issue. And so I think that the word that might be problematic is intervention. As literally all of the seed banks are trying to preserve as much biodiversity through, like perhaps in an agricultural sense, they collect all the varieties of a kind of crop that are wild relatives in addition to the main crops to as a way for crop improvement or disease and pest resistance that's would not be dependent on. I mean, they see the threat of monoculture. I mean, that's really their underlying issue, is to preserve as much biodiversity around these key crops as possible. Now, one of the things that I think Giovanni talks about in his book, Why Look at Plants, and it's kind of a theme that he comes back to, is the whole human-centered nature of our decision-making about plants that can be very short-sighted, where we're looking at economically important plants, and because resources are so limited, it's really, and many times specifically, about what do we know already benefits humans. So maybe it's food, maybe it's timber, maybe it's forage for animals, maybe it's botanical, horticultural specimens for beauty. But very few of the seed banks are able to have the access to resources to save wild plants that there's no known use for. Now, in Australia, because of the rareness, they're very aware of that. And so anytime they destroy, they're going to go in, like a mining company is required to do, there's a botanical survey, and they, an impact statement, and they collect before they ever disturb the land. So, but I think that's something that I think Giovanni's talked about quite a bit too, in terms of plant blindness and thinking about it from this very human-centered point of view.
Giovanni, do you want to step in and say maybe in a few words a little more about your book?
Sure. Just wanted to continue on Dornith's point, and also, Genevieve, harken back to what you said earlier, the idea of nature and resource has come in already, no surprise, I guess. And part of, I think, the conversation Dornith and I had also touched on this idea that it is a complicated, inescapable conundrum that we face as human beings. We depend on nature, and the management of nature in a way or another ends up happening. It has to happen if we want to survive. It's a contingency defined by the number of humans on this planet. We can't just rely on foraging. Imagine a world in which only like a few hundreds of humans were scattered around the globe, then foraging would be still a viable mode of survival. But clearly the management of nature, which many locates back to the origin of agriculture, has defined life on this planet, not just our life. And we do find, there's a very interesting work in the exhibition on indigo. And indigo is such an important plant. I had a meeting of a reading group that I've set up a year ago called Botanical Speculation, dedicated entirely to that plant. And it's one of the plants that really controlled European as well as US markets, the history of India. When you follow the history of indigo, you follow histories that are economic as well as environmental and cultural, that are intimately intertwined in beautiful and horrific ways as well. There are always histories of exploitation, slavery, beauty. It's impossible to find the steady ground. The ground keeps on shifting as you explore the story and find it extremely fascinating and horrifying. And I think, in a sense, this kind of in-between moment that you're describing, Giovanni, has similar characters. There's a beauty to understanding the planet and how it works on a deeper level, and learning how to relate to it differently. And at the same time, there's always this terrible shadow of doom upon us, and the real question of what is our true viable relationship with nature that we're trying to envision. There are many philosophers who have written recently about climate change, and how, I'm thinking, for instance, of Timothy Morton and his idea of hyperobjects, and this idea of an ecology without nature, and that the idea of nature itself as something separate from us is the root of the problem. And yet, it's always complicated or near impossible to transfer those ideas to practical living. It would be beautiful for us to live with nature in a way that doesn't entail this separation, that doesn't entail the conception of resource, objectification, exploitation, extraction, but ultimately it's impossible. And I think the number of us on this planet is seriously placing pressure, putting a lot of pressure on this relationship and our ability or inability to re-envision it, or the possibility to re-envision it.
I like the way you spoke about the shadow of tragedy or shadow of melancholy, because if we look at the history of the last 500 years, we could write that story through the history of so many plants, as so many of our colleagues have, right? If you look at the history of cotton, the history of cotton is a history of history of colonization, history of slavery, history of international trade, the beginning of the American Civil War, and therefore decline of cotton trade with the Americas for Britain, and therefore the ascent of cotton trade from India, for example, right? So large geopolitical shifts and the cultivation of plants such as cocoa, sugarcane, and the Caribbean, for example, or if we were to kind of step back even in time again, the spice trade, right, which is what enlivened the western coast of India for decades. But I'm anticipating some other talks that might hopefully bring this more into relief. But I'm glad you bring this up, because this it's again how do we separate, right, like nature and culture, almost as if they weren't of the same cloth. They are of, and I like the way that you reiterate that argument again and again. I'll embarrass myself a little bit and move on to questions from the audience. And so please do send in more of your questions. I'll start now. So this is a question from Suraj for you, Dornith. Suraj would like to know if the collections in these international seed banks have been sent back, especially to conflict zones where previously existing seed banks were destroyed.
Yes, I know that in Syria, for instance, recently, the first withdrawal from the seed bank in Svalbard was the wheat collection had to be withdrawn so that they could reestablish wheat seed banks. Some seed banks are national, and then some are kind of consortiums around a particular really important crop. Wheat is one of them. And in Aleppo, the scientists couldn't get to the seed bank in Aleppo because of the conflict there. And so they reestablished, they did a withdrawal, grew out new seeds, and made a new seed bank with that same biodiversity in two places this time, in Morocco and Lebanon. So yes, that does indeed happen. It's, it's not necessarily the ultimate doomsday scenario, but it certainly, reflects our political, situation right now.
Yeah. The second question from Lawrence Hill is also for Dornith. In the talk that we just saw, and the discussion with Giovanni, he talked about making the invisible visible with reference to nature. And you spoke in also making scientists and their research, visible. So in the kind of work you do. And Lawrence would like to ask you to expand on this second aspect of making the research visible. And I think it is a fascinating question, especially for us at Science Gallery, where we are trying to kind of find. One of the reasons why your work is fascinating is precisely because you work at that edge, of science and art, and like Giovanni does at science and the humanities and art and the humanities. And so, yes, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your kind words about my work. It's interesting because there's no scientists. I took portraits of the scientists as I was working many times, but there are no people in the series at all. And part of that is to really have people be able to, because it's a dual project. There's the documentary work, which really shows the interiors of these spaces and their lab spaces and the seed banks themselves. But for me, it's really the metaphoric part of it that that allows, I want people to really think about these, the way that the research impacts through metaphor also. And so the X-ray pictures where you have the seeds looking like perhaps they're moving, or the lenticular prints, which we have an animation in the exhibition that kind of references that, where you have plants going from green to blue, talking about the cryogenic process. That part speaks to that, the difficulty of it, making those time frames visible or the efforts of the scientists visible as they try to slow down time. So, to make the seeds last longer. I hope that was an okay answer to that question.
Well, we'll hear, hopefully. If Lawrence, you have a follow-up question, please do send it in.
Yeah.
The next question, I think, is probably directed at the both of you. It's Suraj wanting to know, how do you think galleries or museums can mediate the increasing distance between humans and plants, especially in urban spaces?
Giovanni, do you want to start?
Sure, I can. It's a complicated question. There is a history of plants coming into the gallery space, and our traditional institutions like the biggest museums in the world and creating havoc just on biological grounds. One of the earliest documented exhibitions involving plants was at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It was Steichen's delphiniums that came in the 30s, and they were the first flowers, living flowers, to be presented as works of art in a context of a museum of international importance. And ever since, bringing living plants in the gallery space has been a bit of an ambition, because representing something, of course, is not quite the same as creating an encounter. Or let's say that they're both valid ways of creating an encounter, proposing an encounter, but they're very different. And of course, we can argue too that once we bring a plant, a living organism, in a gallery space, it's no longer really a plant in a proper sense. The same argument applies to animals. What does it mean to bring an animal in the gallery space? So the biological problematics, of course, have to do with humidity, parasites, anything that can live in the soil of plants, especially, is a serious problem to museums. There's an exhibition, an installation by Helio Oiticica that's very famous, called Tropicalia, which involved many potted plants and 2 live parrots. And museums have always faced major challenges. The pots have to be screened. The soil has to be absolutely purified and cleaned of any parasites that could infest the museum. So there are these limitations, and also plants are generally not very happy to live in galleries. Same applies to museums. So the bio presence in museums is per se, I think, a massive challenge. But the one that I think I am concerned with more is this tendency to now bring the living plant in the gallery space as a point of encounter that might be better than representation. When, of course, in the very moment we bring the living plant in the gallery space, it kind of becomes a painting, it kind of becomes a sculpture. It falls victim, and I talk about this towards the end of Why Look at Plants. It falls victim of the semantic powers of the gallery space, because it's how we enter the gallery space that presets our concerns with the exhibit. And in that case, we really have to think out of the box, accept the limitations, and explore new avenues all the time. That's also why I think an online exhibition is no less relevant in this context, because the real encounter with a plant, and when I say real, that's complicated in itself, right? But the unmediated encounter with the plant, if you like, it's probably better experienced out there in the woods, in a forest, in a garden, and even then, what is unmediated?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, again, that's open sort of several questions. I was reminded of what you said, and so I quickly looked it up. The Gran Teatre del Liceu in Barcelona filled its 2,300 seats with plants for a June 22nd concert during the lockdown, which was just completely bizarre, but quite a lovely sort of, intervention. And we are at our end, of course, an online exhibition, but even otherwise, because we are a non-collections based institution, we can, do do such things as not worry too much about, bringing things in that might, affect a collection, and conservation practices to quite the extent as, a conventional museum would have to simply worry about. But it also opens up other questions about, where have plants, in a sense, been brought in, and then, as you say, mediated, right? And if you look at the Japanese practice of bonsai, it's a fascinating world in itself, right? Like to explore. But before I go on to ask my own questions and get carried away again, the next question.
Wait, before we move on.
Oh yes, please.
No, just one thing that Giovanni said in your conversation about how difficult it is to bring plants into the gallery space, and the way that shock of seeing them there makes them almost symbolic. It's interesting to me because it tied into seed banks in that, bringing plants, bringing the materials of the seeds themselves is a super challenge for the same exact reason that there are all these, quarantine rooms that they go through to make sure, they're quarantined, they are slowly, adjusted to temperature and humidity. All those things that are the same issue with the museum are issues in a seed bank. So I just wanted to, make that connection before we moved on.
Not at all. I should have asked you. No, that's actually that's absolutely, again, an incredible connection, because the in a way the reason why bringing a live plant into a museum is a problem is precisely the circumstance that's required to preserve the seeds in a seed bank. So the next question we have is from Purav, who says, what would you say is a way to look at plants in a non-anthropocentric way, if at all? Would you say it's even possible?
No, that is the biggest challenge we're facing. I think it's always possible to try to escape or try to remove ourselves from anthropocentric registers, but ultimately it's us thinking about them. And I think language is key here. If you think about the way in which we articulate the world around us, in which we construct the world around us through language, there is really a level that there is a barrier between us and everything else. The symbolic idea that Dornith just brought in, the idea that we were discussing earlier, that once you put the plant in a gallery space, it becomes like a painting, like a sculpture. It's invested immediately in symbolism, is always there. And that's entirely in our heads. There are no symbols out there. And trying to undo the way in which we've been miseducated, to always think through metaphors, think through symbols, is one of the biggest accomplishments we could get near by becoming aware of anthropocentrism and how anthropocentrism defines our thinking. But we will not necessarily be able to escape anthropocentrism. There are ways in which we can de-objectify plants in the representation. There are ways in which plants can be presented in the gallery space that is less objectifying and that escape the tradition of symbolism and metaphor, which have been the tools through which we have objectified them over time. But ultimately, we'll still be operating in an anthropocentric dimension. I mean, we can argue that art is anthropocentric as a construct itself. One of the questions that's irritated me over time when it comes to animals as being, can animals make art? And there's quite a lot of unnecessary dilly-dallying around the answer. And my answer has always been a negative one, not because animals are inferior to us and cannot make art. It's just that they don't care, because art is a human construct. Art is not just paint on a surface. Art is business. Art is an undertaking involving very human concerns, and animals cannot share those concerns. So an animal, an elephant with a brush in its trunk playing with paint is not art, because the elephant doesn't have any understanding of being an artist and wanting to exhibit the work in a gallery. That is what entails art. Art is a network of activities, right? So in a sense, whenever we bring plants or animals into art, we already are taking them into a territory that it's anthropocentric. So I just care, just to kind of wrap it up quickly, it's about degrees of removal from anthropocentrism, not leaving it all behind.
Yes.
Thank you. I would agree with Giovanni on that, and also make the point that the idea of separating plants out from their ecosystem to look at plants separately is in itself super, super human-centered. You know, that you can't really escape it if you're saying, can we just look at plants without an anthropocentric point of view? It's separating them out from their system, which is kind of how we categorize and think about plants in the first place.
Absolutely. And to your point, Dornith, I think your work also inserts itself in a very complex place in that conversation, because you work with the rationalization of nature, with the managing, with the categorizing. I mean, your work is so entrenched in a thoroughly anthropocentric. We're going back to the idea of resource. One of the main reasons why these seed banks exist, it's because of us, because we want to make sure that one day when things really go, you know, downhill, there'll be a chance to bring back this variety or that variety. And your images, however, I feel are less anthropocentric, or try to kind of balance out that idea, because when you start focusing on seeds, for instance, seeds, as we said in our discussion, is what we sometimes can't even see with the naked eye, can't even appreciate. The way in which you manipulate the images so that they transcend the reality, that the optical reality, is a way to try and kind of reimagine seeds as they could be seen by other entities, not just by our eyes. You know, so there are levels of the work that, to me, establish an interesting dialogue with what it means to look at seeds and look at nature in itself from an anthropocentric perspective, but also less so.
Thank you.
Dornith, may I ask you to tell us a little more about the collections practices of the various seed banks that you encountered? So in a way, you know, are they similar? Are they different? Where do they differ? How do they differ? How do they take decisions? Do they get rid of things? Do they keep them all the time? I'd love to know more about the collections practices.
Well, they do have different philosophies that are somewhat influenced by not only resources, but their particular philosophical and historical backgrounds. So I find that part, the cultural aspect of seed banking decisions, is very, very interesting. And from a scientific perspective, there is a difference between having really broad and shallow collections versus very deep and narrow collections. And for instance, the UK, the Millennium Seed Bank is trying to collect a sample of every plant in the UK that is possible to preserve. And the US has a different strategy, which is much more so, they are collecting wild species as well, but their focus is, you know, food and economic security. And it's in fact managed by our National Security Administration. But the underneath it is this notion of we're going to collect as broad, as rich a collection as possible around a certain topic, as around, corn, for instance. They have just every kind of corn you can possibly imagine, back to teosinte, which is the ancestor of corn they've collected in the wild. So that really, those practices vary quite a bit. There seems to be an emerging agreement that 5,000 seeds collected from a diverse location is enough to preserve a species. So that you don't want to take 5,000 seeds all from the same spot. And I also want to, I think I said this in the talk, but I want to caution people from collecting seeds of rare plants in the wild, because if it's not done properly, you remove its ability to reproduce in the wild. So, so please don't try to help out by collecting rare seeds.
Okay.
I mean, really, like,
yeah.
And then, but what happens is it can make it go extinct in the wild. So.
Yeah. Was there any collection decision or policy that sort of surprised you? Or was there anything quirky that you observed anywhere in your journeys across the world?
Oh, they're all quirky. I mean, just, it's amazing the amount of surprising stories that I would hear. And, I think that one of the thing that we haven't really gotten into is the notion of cloning plants. And, again, in Giovanni's book, he made this really beautiful, I can't remember under which chapter it was. You were talking about how plants are unique, not unique, but one of the interesting things is how their life, what living is, and how you can break off a piece and it will start a new plant, right? That, like, if we cut off our limb, we're, that might make us die, but we're certainly not going to grow a second set of ourselves from that. And so much of our food right now that we eat is preserved as either live collections or clones, which makes them very narrow gene pools. But also, we do it because the offspring of the plants don't retain the characteristics of the parent plants, so that citrus fruit won't grow, another exact type of orange, or apples, but also our nut fruits and stone fruits, so that they are kept in these, the US has a huge facility that's filled with liquid nitrogen holding tanks and little tiny meristems the size of poppy seeds that grow a whole plant. And so that part, I think, is a really interesting, while we're talking about biodiversity, we're also preserving these super narrow gene pools that are these very special plants that we've decided are really perfect. At the same time that they continue to try to, create cultivars that produce new types. I met a really wonderful expert in pecans, which is a type of nut native to the US that is very popular in the South. And, he devoted his whole life to breeding new, really good versions of that. And he has a live collection that they went forth with all the missionaries. So there's pecan groves all over the world that started in the US, and they went out with missionaries, and he went and collected and then brought them back. And has been crossbreeding those to try to make, and he spent his whole life, and I think he's made 7 new types. But to spend your life crossbreeding continuously in an effort to improve a crop and find 7, it's just such an interesting idea about the effort involved in our food supply that we don't even think about when we get paper shell pecans or little native pecans, because I'm from Texas.
Right. Pecan pie, I remember that.
So I would say that that's a really kind of quirky aspect of seed banking that I had really never given thought to, is the fact that we have giant cryogenic preservation just for trees, or kept as poppy seeds.
Giovanni, may I ask you to, in a few words, share with our audiences what critical plant studies is?
Sure. It's a very fascinating field of inquiry, academic field of inquiry, that developed roughly around 2013, 2014. So it's still relatively young. And one of the most famous, one of the most well-known exponents of critical plant studies is Michael Marder, who has brought plants into the discourses of philosophy, Western philosophy has marginalized animals and of course marginalized plants. So he's done incredible work about plants and how we can reconsider their presence in our thinking and also in our being, which is very important. And critical plant studies is also connected to animal studies. Many colleagues I know from animal studies migrated into plant studies, wanting to work with something more radical, no pun intended. But the alterity of plants, in a sense, enables certain discourses to happen that animal studies couldn't quite allow. Animals are, incredibly diverse, and so are plants. But there's something about the biology of plants that perhaps is a little bit more kind of compressed and sane. And it's a field that it's extremely relevant right now. So it's growing, as obviously your exhibition as well is connected to the theories behind it, and hopefully will continue to grow.
Thank you. I would like to now take the opportunity to thank you both for your time, for the talk, the discussion between yourselves, but also with me and the audience, and sharing your thoughts. I think what we saw, at least to my mind, was a coming together of a fascinating array of knowledge and learning. There's Dornith's artistic work, but her deep study of the practices of seed bank scientists and the banking practices and the locations, the incredible, of course, expedition and the experiences of traveling to these places, and which has never been separate from doing scientific research, right? If you look into the history of science, you find that being a part of that adventure is also what brings science alive when you share that knowledge with people. So I want to thank you both for your generosity in sharing your work, your time, and just bringing, everything from philosophy to cultural studies to art history to artistic practice to scientific research in one single discussion, and the sort of wonderful collegiality with which the two of you interacted, not only between yourselves but with us. So thank you again for joining us this evening. And to our audiences, I trust you will be just as impressed with the discussion and fascinated by the kind of things that Dornith and Giovanni have shared with us. Do please share your feedback with us so that we learn more and we interact more with you, and also better ourselves as we move forward. So thanks again to everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.